All right, welcome back everyone. So in today's video, we're going to be continuing our discussion about psychedelics and individuation and this process of releasing our cultural conditioning and transforming into a more authentic, self-actualized individual. And this is basically a continuation of the last video I put up. So if you haven't seen it, it should be the video before this in my video feed. If you look here, there should also be a link to that card, and perhaps down below, I'll also leave a link to the video. So you guys have ways to getting to that if you want to get caught up on this conversation. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of dive into it here, but I want to just kind of introduce some of the concepts and kind of summarize what I said in the last video in case either it wasn't clear to you or in case you didn't watch the other video or what have you. Basically, in that video, what I said is that one of the kind of initial early processes that happens for people with psychedelics that's very common, that's very kind of intuitive, and I think is a very kind of useful place to start, at least to start looking, to start exploring ourselves, and to start seeing maybe what could use some upgrading or updating or transformation inside ourselves, is to look at kind of the lingering, let's say, default conditioning that we were raised with in whatever, place and time and, family and situation we were raised in. So often when we take psychedelics, what we find is there will be kind of these sets of beliefs or ideas or philosophies or reactions and responses or sets of emotions or sets of worldviews, these kinds of things that are kind of legacy default, just kind of floating around inside our attention, maybe not authentically ours, maybe even something we don't agree with or don't totally align with or used to be true for us but aren't currently where we're at, this kind of a thing. And it's a very natural kind of common thing to take psychedelics, start to get enough space inside of ourselves to start to notice these things that maybe we never noticed before. And all of a sudden, that spaciousness, that ability to notice gives us a bit of autonomy, a bit of a point of choice. Do I still agree with this behavior, this belief system, this worldview? Do I want to continue to be this way? Do I think this is a healthy way to be? Is this something I like about myself? Is this something I believe in? Or is this something my parents believe that I kind of just held on to and it is rattling around in the back of my brain somewhere that isn't really my honest personal truth? These kinds of things are this process of deconditioning, of letting go of your kind of default conditioning and starting to take ownership. And I think this is really what the process of individuation entails, taking ownership of what your true value system is, what your true beliefs are, what your true sense of truth or right way of relating or right way of navigating life, etc., is for you. Right? So that's kind of the summary of what I said in the last video. Basically, this is a very common experience that people have with psychedelics. It's a pretty intuitive thing to do. And so a lot of us early on I would say in our first 10, 20, 50, maybe even 100 experiences, we'll be doing some bit of processing pieces of cultural or personal conditioning and evaluating whether or not we want to keep it. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and start to talk about the ramifications of what happens from there. Okay, so once you started to sort through and let go of your default conditioning, start to self-own, what kind of happens next? Let's talk about it. And this, to me, is honestly where things start to get interesting. Let's say, not that, going through that process of kind of reclaiming yourself and owning your values and self-discovery isn't interesting. It's actually profound and beautiful, I think deeply important and super interesting. But there's something that happens as we start to move from the personal value system that we have, the personal beliefs, the personal sets of worldviews that we claim ownership of. Then we take that out into the world, into the collective beliefs and the collective sets of values that I want to start to describe kind of at least how I've seen, what I've seen happen with myself and my kind of trial and error in this process, what I've seen happen with a lot of friends of mine and people that I know who, are psychonauts, who have taken psychedelics and been on this personal growth path and have gone through this process. I've seen a pattern that I'd like to really convey to you here. So basically, as we kind of, expand past our own default conditioning and take up a new set of conditioning, a new set of values that are more authentic, that are more congruent, we're now faced with a new problem. And that new problem is that, generally speaking, human beings are wired for connection and for community and for belonging. We, as a nervous system, are not really built to be in isolation and to be alone. And it's deeply uncomfortable to us, even to those of us that really end up preferring to be alone or needing to be alone. We're wired as a biology for connection and for belonging. And it's pretty intuitive and obvious that as you start to discover whatever your value system are that's more authentic, you're going to want to start to seek out, obviously, community, people who resonate with your value system, or who are close enough of a match that you get each other, that you understand each other, that you connect, that you have a sense of belonging with each other, right? This is super normal. And generally speaking, kind of, what's implicit in what I'm saying here is that communities, as they exist in the world, are organized around sets of values, sets of beliefs, right? So what defines a community ultimately, there will be, potentially, lifestyles and religious practices and rituals and whole, sets of fashion. And there's a lot that goes into what really defines a culture and a community. But if you really, really get down to the heart of it, what defines whether or not you belong to a certain community, it's, do you align with that community's values or don't you? Right? So clusters of people are organized around value systems, right? Now, as we undo our conditioning and discover what our values are and what our authentic beliefs and desires and worldview is, and then we go and we seek out others with this, when we're seeking others out, we are in a place of vulnerability because again, the nervous system doesn't like to be alone. We want to have a sense of belonging. We feel frightened, nervous, ungrounded, rebellious, reactive, overly protective, unsafe, disconnected, hopeless, etc. if we don't have a community or a sense of belonging or a set of people that we can be ourselves and own our personal truth and be safe with people in that authentic truth around, if that makes sense. And so we hit this problem where we're vulnerable and all of a sudden we're reaching out to these communities that share our value system. Now, this creates an interesting thing, which is that all of a sudden let's say you join a community, and this is what I would call a conditioning field. So that new community has a set of values, has a way of being, has a way of thinking, has a way of doing things that if you kind of roughly align with, you may get sucked into, and then now you're being conditioned by this community, right? And maybe that works for you. Maybe you totally share all the ideas and all the beliefs and all the ways of being in that community, but maybe you don't. Maybe you only overlap 40% or 60% or even 80%, but there's a little bit of a gap there where you have a difference in view or being or opinion, right? But what a lot of people do is they trade one set of conditioning essentially for another set of conditioning. So they leave their default conditioning and then they move into a different community and get involved and start to share in this community's conditioning. And that could be, some examples, someone who was raised religious in small town, place, in, let's say, America or Canada or something like that, moves to a city, gets involved in a whole other community. Maybe it's going to university and getting involved in a set of, values and a set of conditioning that comes with going to university. Maybe it's getting involved in an arts community, and then there's a whole conditioning process that happens there, et cetera, right? So we start to move from one value system and one conditioning, and if we're not careful and we're not discerning, we end up just rushing to the next one, and we have not freed ourselves. We have not individuated. We have not liberated our mind. Maybe we've refined what our value system is. We have come closer to being authentic, but we've traded belonging with one group, maybe our family or our town or our local culture or whatever it is we were raised in, and all of a sudden we've traded it for another conditioning field. Now, a lot of times what happens is, as long as you share the values of that community, you will feel a sense of belonging. People will react warmly to you. You'll have a sense of connection. You'll have a sense of sharedness, let's say shared connection, right? But as you start to refine your values further and question things further and explore what you can agree with and don't agree with inside of that community more and more, what can end up happening is that you can end up having a falling out with that community, or having a disagreement that causes you again to unplug from that community. And then that can start to shove you again in the direction of yet another community with a different set of value system, or maybe a different friend group or a different set of, worldviews or what have you. And there are a lot of people who never really catch this for themselves, never really track it, and end up kind of switching between sets of conditioning, but then kind of becoming a true believer of that conditioning. And then they're really not deconditioning themselves. They're just switching what conditioning they subscribe to. And this is kind of a trap that a lot of people get stuck in here. So I hope this is making sense so far. I want to digress a little bit and share a little bit of a concept with you here and kind of plug that back into what we're talking about, just to clarify a little further. Okay, quick concept time here. So this is something I've mentioned before. This is kind of a ubiquitous idea in the personal development world, which comes from a mathematician from the early 20th century, Alfred Korzybski. And there's this phrase of the map is not the territory. Right? The map is not the territory. Very common in personal development work. What does this mean? This means that looking at a map, let's say of a road winding through the redwood forests, as a road trip, and you're looking at a topographical map of the highway and the towns it's going to pass through and all that, is not at all the same thing as being in the car on the physical road, moving through the redwoods, sunlight moving through the trees, wind rushing through the windows, music blasting, hanging out with your friends as you cruise on down the road. Totally different experience, right? Map, territory, not the same thing. Another way of saying this is the symbol is not actually the thing that it's symbolizing, right? A picture of an apple is not the same thing as having that actual piece of fruit in your hand and smelling it and tasting it and biting it and, cooking with it or whatever you're going to do with the apple, right? Another way of saying this that's similar is the menu is not the meal, right? So if you look at a bunch of pictures of food on a menu, you don't eat the menu, right? You eat the food. So the menu is a symbol. It's a representation of an experience that you can have, right? So why am I bringing this up? How does this plug into conditioning fields and what we're talking about here? Well, basically, a lot of times what's happening when you join a community and you've entered into a new conditioning field here is that a lot of communities and a lot of shared value systems and worldviews really confuse map and territory. They really confuse their view, their representation of how life is with the reality of living life. And in that confusing between the representation of the sets of beliefs and the actual lived experience, there's a lot of fine detail that can often get left out. This is the problem with worldviews and ideologies and sets of beliefs and sets of values and joining communities, is that we can end up subscribing based on a shared value system that we think is good, but then end up taking in all these other concurrent beliefs and ways of being that are implicit in order to remain in belonging. And in that, lose a lot of the detail of what we actually think, what we actually believe, what our authentic feelings are, and what our own authentic worldview is, that is more based on our experience of the territory than of maps other people have given us. So I hope this is starting to make sense. And so this is the common problem we see with people kind of in the process of individuation. There's a huge temptation as we are defining ourselves authentically to be suckered into allowing belonging to trap us in a set of, a conditioning field that's going to give us a bunch of beliefs to think and behaviors and ways of living life that maybe feel good for a while, but maybe generally, ultimately aren't authentic for us, aren't healthy for us, aren't our personal truth, but we kind of compromise, we kind of fold, we kind of allow these influences to come in because we generally like the value system of that community, or we really want to have a sense of belonging because we tend to feel ungrounded, frightened, overwhelmed, intimidated by life, by the world, if we don't have a sense of belonging with people, right? Now, in a perfect world, I think we would find community that was adaptive and flexible with our disagreement with certain aspects of it, right? We would find belonging in places with groups of people who were comfortable enough with our, overlap where it exists, but our differences where it doesn't, where we don't overlap, right? But what we find more often is that a lot of times the boundaries of these communities are actually very hard and firm, and you're either in or you're out. You're either a true believer or you're not. And if you're too far abstracted from agreement with some of the principles of that community, you just simply don't belong. And this is something that I do want to say in the internet era is really different now, because it used to be that, so I'm obviously a little bit older. I'm in my mid 40s. I'm Gen X. So I was a young person in the 90s. It's a different world back then, right? And part of that was that you had much more distinct subcultures, right? You had the goth thing and the rocker metal thing and the grunge thing and the hip hop thing and the electronic music EDM thing and the straight-laced business culture and the blah 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 blah, right? All the different like clusters of people organized around whatever their shared passions and interests were much more distinct and separate, right? Now, there were definitely people that moved between them, myself being one of them. But the point here is that these conditioning fields were distinct. And when you were inside them, it was a strong sense of belonging, a strong sense of distinctness of a certain set of values and way of life. And as you moved from one to the other, it was a dramatic, distinct difference. And the impact of the conditioning of these different sets of ideas and ways of being were clearer, were easier to track. But what we find now on the internet is that we have obviously this strange blending and soup and mishmash of all kinds of different sets of conditioning and value systems and ideas clashing in a lot of places, these little purist bubbles in other places, these places of contrarian values where it's like anti-values in other places. And it's really possible to end up with I think it's probably wise to think of the whole internet as a giant conditioning field where it's possible to end up with all these different sets of, inputs and values and places where you feel a bit of belonging in different websites and communities you end up on online. But it's almost more insidious because of that. It's more tempting to just cling to all of that and not question any of it, rather than continuing to do the work of individuating, which really should be a continued process over and over and over of looking at, do I agree with this? Is that my honest, authentic truth? Do I think that's healthy? Do I think that this is a right way of living? What do I think is toxic about this community? What do I think is something that maybe I'm ignoring about this community that I should be looking at more closely and evaluating? What's something I really love about this community? What's something I want this community to be that it isn't, right? You should be looking at these different things and really evaluating for yourself what your personal truth is. And what you'll find, I think a healthy individuated person stands in a place of uniqueness where, in a certain sense, yeah, and if you go and you read Jung, he talks about this a lot. There's a sense of aloneness and isolation and fear. And it's challenging to really stand in your own individuation. It means, in a certain sense, not belonging with anyone in that kind of true school, like we're 100% bought in the same thing kind of way. But it also means that you can finally be authentic with everyone because you're not doing the people pleaser, please welcome me, please I need to belong with you thing in order. So you're not hiding yourself. You're not placating others by toning down who you are, what you believe, what your way of operating is. So you can give genuine, whatever your quality is, genuine you-ness to the world around you, which is ultimately a profound gift, right? This is how we live our gift. We lean into our individuality. We lean into what is a unique expression in the universe that can only be done as you, right? That can only be done through you. And you refine that and you cultivate that to its highest expression in the same way, pardon the cheesy metaphor here, like a bonsai tree, right? Like no two bonsai are the same. They're all sculpted and refined into the perfect expression of exactly what they are, right? And I think it's the same with people. And that's what it means to individuate. And you can't really get there, I think, without being willing to unplug from these conditioning fields. And this is really the risk, right? What happens a lot is people get trapped. They get trapped by ideology, by wanting to belong, by being overly agreeable and placating and being people pleasers to the communities that they belong to. They become afraid to stand up for, whatever their own value system are, or simply take action on that and measure how much overlap they have with these other communities. I think, in my experience, kind of working this process, what I found is that you will always have overlap with other communities because as you start to define it and clarify and access what your value system is, which is how you're going to have a happy, fulfilled life. That values system is going to connect with whatever communities it might be connected to. There are parts of me and parts of my past that definitely overlap with existing communities where I still feel a connection. But that doesn't mean I'm fully bought in and I am 100% a member of any of these communities. Rather, I'm standing outside of them, feeling my places of overlap, but really owning my uniqueness, my difference, and the unique perspective that affords me to give something new to the world, right? There's a lot in what I do here on this channel and what I do with my coaching work and what I do with my group coaching and what I'm teaching that is unique. And it's unique because I come from a set of communities that's generated a unique lived experience than, people who are kind of true school to certain forms of psychedelic therapy or true school to certain forms of hypnotherapy and hypnosis or blah, 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 right? And it's that ability to really own myself and take from all of these, but, bring that together in a new way that empowers me to be able to give you something new and different. And so I think this is really important. I think it takes courage. I think it takes a lot of self-reflection and self-honesty. I think sometimes it means being willing to let go of something that comforts you or brings you a lot of joy or a lot of peace or a lot of, pleasure. But what you get from authenticity, from self-alignment, from listening to the divine current moving through you, if you will, and honoring that above honoring, belonging to predefined groups it's so much more powerful. It's so much more beautiful. It's so much more profound. And this is what I think individuation, again, really is. What we see a lot is, I'm kind of repeating here, but just to kind of sum up, what we see a lot is people getting stuck. And this is the problem, so you start on this process, you start taking psychedelics, you start realizing who you are or what you believe or what you resonate with and what you don't, what your truth is. And then you kind of move into a place as you bring that out into the world where it's really easy for these groups that have opinions and perspectives and even agendas to prey on you and suck you in because you're vulnerable, because you want to belong. But if you recognize it as another conditioning field, and you move through it, maybe you enjoy your time in that conditioning field without holding on to it as a solid thing. Because here's the other thing about all these groups and conditioning fields, they're all changing too. Everything around us is always moving, right? Life is movement. It's not static. Communities, generally speaking, change over time. And so even if you were to try to subscribe to one of these communities and take comfort in them and stay put, that's not going to happen. It's going to move. It's going to change. And possibly in ways that ultimately over the long run, over the big picture, don't totally align with your personal truth. So I think the wisdom here is really to continue to take the best, learn, enjoy, experience these conditioning fields, but recognize them as conditioning fields. Continue to challenge and question and discern what pieces of the conditioning that you're still taking in aren't for you, aren't things that you resonate with, don't align with your personal truth, don't look healthy or right, and continue to refine that until you come to a place of absolute authenticity and autonomy and personal freedom and personal empowerment. So that's my message to you guys. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, on here on the YouTubes, if you like this kind of content, do all the things, like, subscribe, interact. Let me know what you think about this. I always appreciate it. And I'll see you guys in the near future. Much love.